All right, in the last few days, I've had about 3 or 4 people send me an article published in the BBC. And when you hear the title, you'll understand why, and I wanted to talk about it. So, the title of the article, published on April 17th, is My Son Killed Himself After Circumcision. And several subscribers, and actually some people who I don't even know from YouTube, sent me this video. And I read the article, and I'll put a link in the description here. And uh, I was conflicted about making a video about this. This touches on several topics that I think are important and that are interesting, but obviously you don't want to make a big deal out of a tragedy like this because this was a tragic situation. But the victim, and in this case it's a man by the name of Alex Hardy who committed suicide, wrote a letter to his mother, a woman by the name of Leslie Roberts, expressing his reasons for committing suicide and basically saying that he wants his death to be used as not necessarily a talking point, but as a reason for debate and discussion on the topic. So I think that is, if anything, a good reason to go into the topic. And like I said, his story is a very interesting one. It's an unusual angle or nexus on the circumcision video, especially from someone coming from my perspective. But it touches on several really important points that I've touched on briefly in other videos, but never so explicitly. So let me just give a little of the background of the story, which you can read. I'm looking for more details. Apparently, he wrote quite a bit and wants his mom to release a lot of that information, but I don't know how much she has. But so anyway, Alex is from the UK. So right there, makes this story unusual because I think he was, 23, 25, something like that. So he's in a generation where over 90% of the boys born in his age in the UK would be uncircumcised. He had phimosis. For those of you who aren't familiar, phimosis is I don't want to say an illness, but a condition where the opening of the foreskin is restricted. Sometimes it's just restricted in the sense that it's just a small opening, and sometimes it's restricted in the sense that the tissue at the opening is not as elastic as it should be, and thus unable to open wider. And because of this, it is not possible to retract the foreskin over the heads. Now, there's different versions of it. There's paraphimosis, where you can retract when you're flaccid, but not when you're hard or erect, or also versions where you can retract, but then it gets stuck behind the head, also a type of paraphimosis. And then there is a kind of a misdiagnosed version called congenital phimosis. This is something that was really prominent in the buildup of and the popularization of medicalized circumcision. So when circumcision was being popularized as a medical practice, it wasn't necessarily the case that doctors thought that it was necessary for everybody to be circumcised. But because they believed that it was necessary to keep the penis clean, and they also had other reasons regarding STDs and sexual pleasure, that if you could not retract the foreskin, that you could therefore not keep the penis clean. And so if you had a child, say a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old child, who could not retract their foreskin, that was a sign of quote-unquote congenital phimosis, and that was grounds for getting circumcised. And so many boys, millions probably, in the US and in the UK, if you go back far enough, were circumcised because they could not retract their foreskins as children. Now, what used to be known way back and is now better known, but still not by everyone who should, is that a foreskin in most babies is fused to the glands of the penis at birth. And that it only by a membrane, all right? It's not just that it's a tight foreskin, it's that it's actually fused to the glands. And this is actually to keep it clean so that you don't get infections. And over time, the membrane dissolves, usually from the activities of the child playing with his penis will slowly work it off. And you basically have a bell curve type situation on at different age groups, a different ratio of the male population in a given cohort will be able to retract their penis. So there's some who it's possible at birth, but it's like 1% or less. At 10, I think 10 is about the when 50% can retract, but there are some who can't do it when they're 15, 16, or even 17. So the point here is that you cannot be diagnosed with congenital phimosis when you're 8 or 9, because the vast majority, a majority of boys at that point would not be able to retract perfectly naturally. And there was an epidemic in this country and in all the Anglosphere countries of having boys circumcised for that reason. Uh, there's also a related issue that's not quite as severe as circumcision called forced retraction, where doctors would say, hey, you need to keep the foreskin, the penis clean. Obviously, circumcision is the best thing to do, but if you, for some reason, don't want to do a circumcision, you need to retract that foreskin so you can clean underneath it. Now, the problem is, if there's a membrane there and you forcibly retract, this will cause a lot of pain. This could cause a lot of damage, a lot of scarring, and a lot of bleeding. In fact, sometimes the scarring and damage caused will actually scar the opening of the foreskin and create later actual phimosis. And we're not sure how often this happened. It happened millions of times. There's actually quite infamously a study. If you ever hear studies that circumcision helps reduce the rate of UTIs, one of the earlier studies that was done on that, the physician administering the study admonished parents, okay, we have the circumcised group of babies and the uncircumcised group of babies, and we're going to see who gets more UTIs. Sounds like a decent study. But then he told the parents of the uncircumcised babies that, as part of their proper hygiene, they should retract their babies' foreskins, which is something that can be very painful and very bloody, and in fact open up the possibility of infections. And I think the study was done some time ago, and so you have these parents, mostly mothers, but probably fathers too, who are told this is what you need to do, and they do it. And lo and behold, these uncircumcised babies had higher rates of UTIs than the circumcised babies, and the fact that there was this confounding factor of this forced retraction was lost. You can cynically say that maybe the doctor understood that and was deliberately adding that detail to weigh the results in a way that he would like. I have no idea if that was his motivation. He very easily could have been ignorant, because this is still something that doctors even today very often don't realize and still advertise people to do this. In fact, when I went to the UK, I met a charming young man who at the time was, I think, maybe 20. So he's from a relatively recent age cohort. And we're friends on Facebook, and I had made a post about foreskin restoration at one point, and he messaged me and he said that he read it and it really touched him. And he said his most painful memory, one of his earliest memories, was as a 5-year-old, his mother forcibly retracting his foreskin. Now, she wasn't doing this as some kind of deviant sexual behavior. She wasn't doing this to molest him. She wasn't doing this to try and hurt him at all. She had, and he's not sure why, but he believes that she had been informed by a doctor that she needed to clean him, and that the way that she needed to do that was to forcibly retract his foreskin. Now, not that many 5-year-olds are naturally capable of doing this. Some are, most aren't. And so the process of her forcibly doing this retraction was extremely painful. And he said the memory, he goes, it's the most painful thing he has any memory of, and that this probably scarred him for life. In fact, he associates his penis with pain and with suffering. So he's not circumcised, he's uncircumcised, but he's still suffering from that trauma, which was quite significant. And that is an ancillary thing. So sorry for the tangent there, but I think it's a pertinent information for what goes more into the study. So Mr. Hardy, Alex Hardy, had phimosis, and apparently he had true phimosis. He could not retract his foreskin over his head, and he had this into his 20s. So this is somebody who has true phimosis. Not congenital phimosis, not misdiagnosed phimosis, an actual problem, quote unquote, with his foreskin. Now, how much a problem for phimosis is a good question, because I have met men in their 20s and 30s who have phimosis, who have never retracted their foreskins, who have never even seen the heads of their penises, and they're fine. They don't have a problem. They don't get infections. They don't have diseases. They are not inhibited in their sexual function at all. And they're happy the way they are. And they all are aware, all the ones that I've met are fully aware that circumcision is an option, and they choose not to have it. On the other hand, there are men who it is a problem for. So it's not as black and white as some people would make it sound, because there are people who live with it quite happily and there's others who don't. But it is an actual condition, though. So Hardy moved to Canada, and he ended up living in Canada for about 5 years. They don't say what province, based on the fact that he liked to ski. It sounds like it was in British Columbia, but maybe Alberta, but we're not sure. I'm not sure anyway. And he went to see a urologist, and the urologist said that he should get circumcised. He apparently asked about other techniques, maybe stretching techniques that he had heard about, and the doctor just told him straight up that they would not work for him. Uh, it's unclear if that was really true or not. Stretching techniques do seem to be pretty effective. There's products you can get. One that comes to mind is something called Phimosis, which is basically just a series of graduated discs that you insert into the opening of your foreskin, and they slowly make it bigger. So it's very similar to the process of getting ear discs. And based on what I've read, obviously I didn't have this as a personal experience, but it takes about 6 weeks for most men to be able to gradually open the opening of their foreskin enough that they can fully retract. So it's a non-surgical, it's very cheap, it's very safe. Sometimes people will use steroid creams in conjunction with this. However, it is possible, if his foreskin was scarred or in some other way damaged or inelastic, that stretching techniques may not have been effective. I don't know what percentage of phimosis cases are that, or which percentage are curable or treatable through stretching methods, and I don't know if any of them apply to Alex or not. It's not too relevant as far as the story goes. So he gets circumcised, I think that says in 2015, and he had an extremely negative reaction to his circumcision. The head of his penis, which understandably was extremely sensitive, after having been completely covered for his entire life and never having been exposed, was now completely exposed to everything: underwear, clothing, bedding. Even if he was touching it to masturbate, he liked to ski, and all these activities, any activity whatsoever, became painful. Some of the material that was removed, so the entire prepuce, the frontal band, which by some estimates is the most sensitive part of the foreskin, which is basically the tip where the outer skin rolls over to become the inner mucosal membrane of the inner foreskin. That's now completely gone. His frenulum was removed. Frenulum is one of those things that is sometimes removed in circumcision and sometimes left. It's usually damaged to some degree, but sometimes, in some cases, it's mostly left, but it's usually either mostly damaged or mostly gone. His was mostly gone. In his article, in his letter, apparently he references this specifically and says that it was definitely the most sensitive part of his penis. It was the most erogenous area of his body, of his sexual identity. It was kind of like the focus of it, he found out in the aftermath, and it was completely removed. So you have a situation where whatever problems he may have had before, and apparently he did have some real problems, that's why he sought out a surgical solution. And there's some evidence that apparently he tried to do greater research, but his laptop was broken, so he was unable to go online to learn about alternatives. And he was not really able to talk about this. This is another problem, and I don't mind talking about this, but I also find this to be an unusual type of conversation to have in public, and yet I think it's one that needs to happen because a lot of people do have a hard time discussing this topic, and it's very detrimental not only to themselves but to the public at large. Like, there's a negative externality in the fact that these issues are not talked about frankly, which allows practices like circumcision to kind of continue in this taboo blind spot where we can't have polite conversation about what is actually a fairly significant issue, personally anyway. So he ended up committing suicide 2 years after the circumcision. He wrote his mother an email about it, and basically said that he wants his death to mean something, and he wants people to become alert to the dangers of circumcision. And so there's a couple things to be said here. First, humans are complex animals, and the decision to commit suicide and the conviction to actually do it, I think it's very unlikely that ever has a single cause, right? You can look at the entire totality of his life and all the deterministic variables that go into the process of making any set decision, and it's very unlikely that there's a 1-to-1 ratio. So all of this is to say that, there's probably other things going on with him. Some people have been saying, well, he obviously had major mental health problems. It's not obvious that he had major mental health problems. It's possible to commit suicide without having major mental health problems. And also, if he did have major mental health problems, it could be very, very well be that the circumcision either caused them or exacerbated them or made them worse or contributed to them. But I will say that I agree that like it is unlikely that this was the only thing that mattered. However, I don't think that we can then trivialize it and say it must not have been that important and that we're probably dealing with somebody who is just so unstable that they were probably at a great risk of committing suicide. And, the circumcision is just kind of an excuse or an easy answer. Um, as far as I can tell, and I'm not a psychologist here, and I don't know this man personally, but based on what he wrote and the way others described him, he was happy, he was high functioning, he had a good life, he had a lot going for him. There were no suicidal tendencies that people were aware of, and he was quite explicit in the letter that this was the problem. So I think that it's quite reasonable to assume that indeed this was the major factor, even if there were other factors that had some influence. And I can just say personally that this makes a lot of sense. Again, people don't like to talk about it, but a man's penis is a part of his identity at the very least. Now, how much of the what fraction of his identity is? Well, I don't know how we can quantify it in any kind of scientific way, and it probably varies from person to person. But if you imagine your average guy has a penis. He likes his penis probably. He's proud of it in some sense. It's wrapped up in his own ideas of his sexual prowess. It's the physical junction of his of sexual pleasure, whether it's with a partner or on his own, and that's an important part of someone's life, someone's identity. And to then take that and then to radically alter it surgically, and to invert it from a thing of pleasure and a pride into something of shame and pain and loss, right? So instead of feeling all this rainbow of colors of sensation that you had growing up your entire life, have that be replaced by just numbness and in his case apparently excruciating pain. That's quite an inversion, and that would be quite traumatic for anybody. And I've met people who had not as dramatic but similar experiences. And I've related this story before, but I know not everyone has gone and watched all of my videos, so I'll relate it again. I met a guy once, and we hooked up, and sometimes you can tell somebody who is circumcised later in adolescence as opposed to as a neonate. When someone's circumcised as a neonate, a clamp is used, and you end up with a very dark scar usually. And the glands of the penis, because the prepuce is fused to the glands with a membrane, the first thing they kind of have to do is rip the foreskin off the glands, which scars the glands for life. And so a man circumcised as a baby is going to have scarred glands. And a man who's circumcised later in life, they're not going to use a clamp. Probably they'll use some kind of surgical implement, and you, instead of getting the dark scar of crushed skin, you get a fine, sometimes it's not always the same, but you sometimes get just kind of a fine series of suture lines, and then the gland will still be smooth. It will be dry, but it won't be covered in the scarification that you see on a guy who's circumcised as an infant. So anyway, I was with this guy, we were messing around, and I mentioned, I was like, hey, by any chance were you circumcised as an adolescent? Because his gland was very smooth and unscarred, and the sutured lines did not look like those created by the Gomco clamp, which is by far the most common used in infants in the United States. And he said, yes, he was circumcised when he was 17. And the story with him, kind of similar up to a point with Alex's story. He had paraphimosis, so he could retract his foreskin, but it would become stuck behind his head when he was hard, which was inhibiting his sex. He was having a hard time. He would be in the act and it would get stuck, and he would basically have to become flaccid to get it back. And, that would be very irritating and aggravating. And his doctor suggested that he get circumcised. His doctor made no mention of using stretching techniques, either because he was unaware of them or because he was just a big advocate of circumcision. And in the US, it could be either one of those. And the doctor then also said, don't worry. Everything will be fine after. There'll be no difference in terms of your quality of sexual experience. Everything will feel the same. you'll just won't have that problem anymore. Well, a doctor tells that to a 17-year-old boy. He's not going to probably know any better. He's not going to second guess this authority figure. And so he agreed, and he got circumcised when he was 17. And he said that kind of in an opposite kind of way, after the quite quickly, the sensitivity in his gland deteriorated to the point where he said he described it as he feels nothing, that all the sensation that he had before was gone, and that in relative terms, what he was left with was nothing. He said that he could not ejaculate, he could not achieve climax for 6 months after, and that he cried himself to bed for months and months. Right, so I don't know what the chronology there, what it actually was, but this is what he said. He said 6 months for both. That he would cry himself to sleep every night, that he felt absolutely desperate, that he had basically just ruined his life sexually, and that weighed on him very heavily. Now, he ended up not committing suicide, and it would be very easy to then kind of point to people like him and say, see, he didn't commit suicide, so what's the big deal? Well, their circumstances weren't the same, and what they experienced wasn't exactly the same. But the common thread here, though, is that you have a doctor who's recommending this, who is not discussing alternatives or is dismissing alternatives, and B, is not alerting them to the potential risks. Okay, so the risk of committing suicide, I have to say, is probably quite low. It obviously can happen. We have at least one documented case, and there's probably more than that. But even accounting for those, it's probably not very common. But men do report having lost a lot of sensitivity. Now, not all men, and I want to talk about that in a second here. But if your doctor you can't make you can't properly consent. You can't make informed consent if the doctor does not inform you about the potential problems. Oh, there's a chance that you could have an allergic reaction. Oh, there's a chance in the surgery that you could die, even if it's a small chance. You have a right to know that. And you have a right to know that some men who are circumcised as adults come to regret it later. And so you should know that before you just decide to have then basically an irreversible surgery done to you. So there's a couple themes here I want to touch on. One is the vast over diagnosis of phimosis and of circumcision as a palliative. There are cases, I'm sure, where circumcision is not only a good answer, it might be the only answer. It is possible that there are certain situations where you have medical problems, medical issues that either other therapies don't work, or you maybe have tried the other therapies and they're just not as effective. Or you might have a man who, for other reasons independent of strict medical efficacy, might prefer circumcision. So I know a guy who got circumcised as a 30-year-old because he was Jewish. He was from the UK. He wasn't circumcised at birth. As he got older, he got more interested in his Jewish heritage, and he really wanted to get circumcised. Now, he didn't have any problems with phimosis, but let's just say that he had, and the doctor said, hey, we could do a stretching technique and you would be able to fully retract. And he goes, I would just assume get circumcised because I would feel like it would be more in heritage with my Jewish tradition. That's totally fine. Might not be the decision that I would make or that others would make, but he was informed of what was possible, and that's the choice he made, and that's good. And that's, I think, the major issue here that I'll touch very briefly, is that there's an enormous ethical difference between a consenting adult deciding they want this procedure done after getting informed medical advice and having granted informed medical consent to have it done, to doing it to an infant. Okay, that is a gigantic logical leap that the advocates for circumcision make without any kind of justification. There's other reasons that they use to justify infant male circumcision besides this, but just get that out of the way. That's one of them. But beyond that, it depends on the culture that you're from and where you live. So in Europe in general, and in most of Asia, and in much of Africa, and most of Latin America, doctors typically do not turn to circumcision. These are not cultures that value circumcision. These are cultures that see an intact penis and a foreskin as a valuable part of being a man. Now, it's not the only part to being a man. They're not foreskin fetishists. They just realize this is part of being a man, and we shouldn't just eliminate it willy-nilly. But sometimes it may be necessary. In cultures that are more, and you could look at them as either being more pro-circumcision or more anti-foreskin or some combination of the of the two, and the two are not exactly the same. There's a lot of rhetoric in the medical literature in the United States, for instance, that pathologizes foreskin. It's dirty, it causes disease, it has no function, it's just an extra flap of skin. Um, it's vestigial, and you can just diminish it. And part of these, almost all those critiques have some kind of grain of truth in the sense that, yes, you can have problems with your foreskin. You have problems with any part of your body. We can start pathologizing your ears or your nose, or your eyes, or your hair, or your testicles, or your breasts, or your skin, or your teeth. Right? Those are all things that you can have problems with, and we could actually write entire books listing all the problems you can have with any body part. And those medical issues range from annoying or very minor to potentially lethal and life-threatening. And yet, listing the potential problems is not a sufficient reason to amputate a healthy part of the body just because it might hypothetically have a problem, unless there's really, really compelling evidence. Say, women who have the gene that makes them predisposed to having breast cancer. I think there's a gene that makes it like 99% likely that a woman will have breast cancer after a certain age. Well, a mastectomy might be warranted in that case, but that's a very specific case. You wouldn't say all women should have mastectomies because some of them are at great risks. And the reason this logic breaks down is because the body parts, whatever problems they may have, what other pathologies they may entail, what other infections might become possible because of their existence, they have functions, they have value, they have a purpose. They evolved. They were selected for by evolution for a purpose. And while you might be able to survive without them, that doesn't make them vestigial or worthless. And foreskin definitely falls with it. Foreskin definitely has a purpose. Now, many Americans don't know what that is or even imagine that there is one. And I've had doctors tell me that the foreskin has no known function. There's no known reason for why it's there. And so, the pros and cons. Even if the reasons for circumcision are quite minor, it doesn't need to have a good reason because there's no loss, there's no downside. You're just removing something that's extra at the end of the day anyway. So in the United States, circumcision, and it depends on the doctor. Not all doctors are like this, but many doctors vastly, vastly overprescribe circumcision. We have the whole case, as I mentioned earlier, of congenital phimosis, where young boys basically who are too young to have reliably retracted their foreskins naturally are being told, you have phimosis, you need to have surgery, and this is done. Or you need to be forcibly retracted so you can be cleaned under there and having all the problems associated with that, often leading to circumcision subsequently. And this can range from, the occasional suggestion to pediatricians or urologists hammering people every time. I've read testimonies of guys who said every time they went to their doctor, if they had a sore throat, if they had a toothache, if they had anything, bunch of bikes, that their doctor would be like, well, you should get circumcised, you should get circumcised, you should get circumcised, you should get circumcised. And by the time they're 11 or 12, they're like, fine, just do it. Apparently, this is some horrible thing. I've heard stories of men in the locker room who are changing, and there's a doctor with them, and the doctor will just look at their uncut penis, and having no information at all that this person has any kind of medical issue or any kind of regret or any kind of desire to get circumcised, will just say, have you thought about getting circumcised? And not in like a casual, jocular, humoristic, jokey way, which, that's fine, I guess. I wouldn't make a joke like that, but yeah, you could make a joke like that. But more in the sense of like, hey, you should get circumcised because you have a foreskin. And I had a friend who had unrelated issue and was going in, and the urologist said, hey, do you want me to circumcise you while we're doing this other surgery? And he was like, I have no problem with my foreskin. I never have. I've never complained about it. Why would the urologist just automatically assume that it should be done, right? So that kind of bias is definitely out there. Does it apply to all doctors? Absolutely not. Do they all feel it that strongly? Absolutely not. But it's definitely a real thing. And when you have patients going and they're getting medical advice from people who are having a bias, which I think in all fairness can only be described as a cultural bias, right? It's not a bias that is warranted by the medical literature, which is scant in terms of what it actually is. There's a lot, I don't want to say scant, there's been lots of studies, but the conclusions they reach to are quite limited and quite contentious. And that so they in themselves would not kind of warrant the degree of of uh, promoting this procedure among certain elements of the population. Now, Canada has a much lower circumcision rate than the US, but much higher than Europe. And there's a strong influence of the United States on Canada as far as this goes, especially in places like Alberta, which is basically like the 51st state. I don't know if he was in Alberta when this happened. It sounds like he was in BC, so it could be that the proximity there doesn't matter, or maybe it does. I'm not sure. So yeah, you have a complete overestimation of the value of circumcision. You have a complete lack of awareness about restoration, or doctors are completely ignorant about it usually, or they completely dismiss it. It's unclear if Alex Hardy was aware that restoration is a possibility. Restoration definitely would have been helpful for him, I think, because while the specialized tissues that were lost, his frenulum, his frontal band, those can't be replaced by restoration. He could recover his glands with skin, and that skin, that the restored foreskin mimics the prepuce pretty much exactly, other than the frontal band and the frenulum. I might be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure it looks very similar. The inner foreskin, there's always some remnant of inner foreskin left that can be expanded to recover the glands, and the outer dermis, there's plenty of that on the shaft that also can be regrown. So that would have provided the protection that he needed. Now, that takes years, and whether he could have trooped through that or not, I don't know. They also make products that you can buy that can help alleviate it, and there's a Canadian product called a manhood, which is basically just like a silk fake foreskin that you wear over your glands to keep it covered. And there's other products along those lines. So I don't know if he was completely unaware of that or not. But I think that had he been restored, it definitely would have helped, and it would have given you something to work towards, something to look forward to, something to say, hey, this can get better. One of the great frustrations with restoration is that it's very unlikely that it's going to get it as good as it could have been or to your natural state, but it can get better. It can move you in that direction, which for most people is going to be good enough. There's some people that it's not going to be good enough, and those people are basically hoping that 4Gen and other gene therapies out there, tissue regeneration therapies out there, advance fast enough and become reliable enough that they have other options at some point. And I think that that's very likely, but the time scale at when that becomes likely, I just don't know, and I'm not willing to wait. So yeah, so it touches on the pathologizing of the foreskin, especially in the cases of phimosis. There are times when phimosis is a problem and needs to be treated somehow. It can usually be treated non-surgically. When it is treated surgically, it doesn't have to be circumcision. Also, as an adult, you can dictate kind of how much. Just take a little bit. Just take the tip. Do a Brit Milah, Michelangelo David's type circumcision, where you just take the tip or enough to retract the foreskin. That would leave the frenulum. That would leave the gland covered. You would appear to be uncircumcised. You would have most of the function of an uncircumcised penis. You would just be losing some of the sensation. And I don't want to minimize that. I think that is a big deal, but it would be less. And you can tell that to your doctor. This is, again, a huge difference between an infant who cannot tell a doctor, hey, I kind of want to keep my frenulum because it's the male G spot and blah, blah, blah. So there's that. There is the cultural ignorance of the doctors, or the cultural biases of doctors, which is going to be an issue in the United States and in Canada, and to a lesser extent in places like the UK. So basically anyone watching my videos. So there's another kind of issue here, which is the surveys of men who are circumcised as adults. So there's always this perennial debate about the effect of circumcision on sexual pleasure and sexual function, with the idea being, look, men who are circumcised as babies, they have nothing to compare it with. They were never circumcised, and they were never in a position to have sex uncircumcised, so they don't have anything to compare it with. And obviously men who are uncircumcised never had sex circumcised, so they have nothing to compare it with. And so you have these two populations with no overlap in experience, and so there's no kind of intersubjective way to compare one with the other. And that is a big problem in terms of exploring the issue in a communicative way. But we have these two other groups, one much larger than the other. One is men who restore their foreskins, so the men who have grown up and been circumcised their whole lives, and they restore their foreskins, and they can't comment on being fully intact or fully natural, but they have moved along that spectrum to where they've become much closer, and they will have that added perspective, which is, I think, a very valuable one. But a larger group are those who get circumcised as an adult, and they can also go back and say, oh, well, this is what it was like when I was cut, and this is what it was like when I was uncut, and we can compare and contrast. And that's a larger group. And then there's even some who have done both. And I did an interview on this channel a couple months ago about a man who got circumcised as an adult and then subsequently, a few decades later, restored. Now, I want to talk about these studies briefly because they're brought up often. There's lots of problems with these studies of men who are circumcised as an adult. The data is conflicting. Some of them report that there's sensation loss, but they don't mind. They were hoping for that, or they're okay with that. Some men report nothing's wrong. Some report that they feel better. And, you know, so there's a couple problems with these studies. The more minor problems are a lot of these studies are very short term. I've never seen one that goes past 5 years. Most only go a year or two. The effects of circumcision don't end, it's not like the full effects happen within a year. The loss of sensitivity of the glands can take several years. There's also the problem that having it as an adult is not the same as having it as a child. The procedure is different. As I've talked about earlier in this video, circumcising, the ethical difference is just gigantic. But just physically, the surgical difference is different because the infant's glands are fused to the foreskin. So you have to damage the glands. You have to remove basically the frenulum. And you're going to use a clamp to crush it. You can't use anesthetic. You can use some local anesthetic, which they still don't do in every case, but local anesthetic is not the same as general anesthesia. It's not safe to use general anesthesia on a neonate. And you can do those things with an adult. An adult can dictate what they want. Also, an adult can understand what's happening. So even if they do experience pain and discomfort, they have a psychological ability to be like, hey, I'm doing this for a good reason. This is a good cause. This is something where, even though it kind of has a negative rap, the ritualistic circumcision that is more common in much of the world. So you have Jews and Americans circumcise their babies, their youth. But in other cultures, say in the Philippines or sub-Saharan Africa, where circumcision is practiced, it's done as a ritual. And those is sometimes, not in all those cultures, it's less sanitary. It's there's a much higher surgical risk of infection or of so-called botched circumcisions. But in those cases, at least the men understand, hey, this is part of my cultural heritage. It's supposed to be a sacrifice. It's supposed to be painful. It's supposed to be an ordeal. And that gives them some psychological ability to cope with what's happening. A newborn baby does not have any of those things. It is just suffering extreme trauma and pain that it can't understand. And the effects on its brain development and on its subsequent life are going to be magnified tremendously because it's happening at such an important developmental stage as opposed to an adult or a late adolescent, which is also basically an adult. So there's that. But the main problem with these studies, I can quibble about the time scales and all, but the main problem is every single one of them, quite blatantly and quite obviously, suffers from selection bias. You're only studying men who, for whatever reason, decided to get circumcised as an adult. If you look at the whole, and there could be different reasons why men do that. They could have psychological reasons. You could have men who fetishize circumcised dicks. I definitely have encountered that. There are men who they're uncircumcised and they just think that cut people are, that it looks better and that there's something about themselves that they find shameful. And, that could be valid in its own way. But then when they decide to get circumcised, then their psychological biases are going to heavily weight their reportage of what happens. And there's also the whole buy-in effect. If you make the choice to have a surgery, you don't want to tell yourself, oh my gosh, I fucked up. Maybe that was the wrong surgery. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. You want to tell yourself, hey, I did the right thing. This is for me. This is what I want. That's going to color the way you look at it. But even more than that, just deciding to get it done in the first place. If we look at, 100,000 intact adult men, the vast majority of them don't want to get circumcised for whatever reason, and they choose not to get circumcised. And then some small percentage of them, 1% or 2%, decide to get circumcised. And then we do a study of that small percentage, that 1 or 2%, and say, foreskin doesn't really matter because the men who decided to get their foreskins cut off report that there's no real change. Well, those men could have, for whatever reason, been the 1 or 2% with the most problems with their foreskin. They could have been the 1 or 2% who had phimosis or balanitis, or who had other kinds of problems, paraphimosis. Maybe they did have a lot of infections. Maybe they just, they were less sensitive. I talk about all the time, intact men are more sensitive. It's quite obvious that sensitive erogenous tissue is removed in circumcision, but there's still a bell curve in terms of what men experience. And again, drawing on my experience as a gay man, the reactions that intact men have are not all the same. Some intact men, when you stimulate their foreskins, react extremely strongly and extremely positively, and others, from the exact same stimulation, react less strongly, right? So there's this range there, and if we were to take the ones who react the least, who have the least amount of pleasure associated with it, they might be more likely to decide to get their foreskins removed. And when they do, and then we do a survey of them, we could say, see, foreskin is not really valuable because this is self-selecting tiny fraction of the population that decided to get circumcised reports that there's no big difference. That is selection bias, plain and simple. To do a real study, you would have to take a random group of, the larger group, the possible 10,000, 50,000 men, and men who were not looking to get circumcised, who didn't want to get circumcised, who had no dog in that fight, and just circumcise half of them and not the other half, and then do the surveys from there. And there'd be problems with that study as well, but the main one is that it would be completely ethically wrong. That you can't just go and forcibly circumcise men. You can do it to babies, but not men. And you can only do it to men who want to get circumcised. So these studies are basically worthless in terms of predicting, you can't say a newborn is going to be one of the guys who, when they're 25, doesn't really get much out of his foreskin or has a circumcision fetish or has shame about his foreskin for whatever reason. And that's another side topic that I've talked about, but many American men who are uncircumcised feel shame for being circumcised because it's socially condemned and socially stigmatized as dirty, as disease-ridden, as alien, as weird, as strange, as undesirable from women, less so from men. But so you don't know that a newborn is going to feel any of those things, so you can't just assume, well, there's a 1% chance that he'd want to get circumcised, so we aren't then justified in doing to him as a baby. So I could see someone going to somebody like Alex Hardy and saying, look, here's a study of Turkish men who got circumcised, and they report everything's fine. And in that case, you have people who are doing it for ostensibly for a religious reason. There's a lot of cultural pressure to conform, and these are men who are deciding to get circumcised. So what about all the uncircumcised Turkish men who didn't want to get circumcised? Well, they're not in the survey. We're only surveying the ones who wanted to get circumcised, and so if you're not one of those people, the survey is really of no use to you. So yes, and I think what a lot of people, when they hear about this story, are going to think, gosh, this guy that's such an overreaction. And I'm not saying that he should have committed suicide. I wish that he hadn't. I wish he had found another way or whatever, and that this hadn't happened. But you have to understand how intensely personal this is. It's an interesting trick when you do it to a neonate and they grow up. They are not going to, even if they have problems, even if those problems are definitely a result of the circumcision, and that is sometimes the case. I've met guys who had skin bridges, who had scarred gland tissue, who had extremely tight to the point where they had curvature, or where they had painful erections because there was so little skin that when they got hard, it would just almost tear. And yet, they did not know that any of that was a result of circumcision. They had no idea. Even skin bridges, because nobody ever told them, and they just grew up and that's how it was, and they just figured, well, I don't know, I look different from other guys, but everyone looks a little different. Maybe I got caught in the zipper, or there was a fire, or I don't know. And so even though they may have problems with these things, they don't associate them with circumcision. And the psychological effects of the trauma being inflicted on a neonate just has not been studied very well. We do know things like it increases or decreases their pain tolerance for up to a year after. So baby boys who are circumcised are just more susceptible to pain, at least for a year afterwards. I think that that's not something that should be considered trivially insignificant, but the full effects haven't really been studied. So we can't say, how significant it is. It's just obviously something. But those people, when they grow up, are not going to, if they have, attachment issues or antisocial behavior or violent tendencies or whatever it is. And those are all things that you can have without circumcision. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that's the only explanation for everything, but it could very well be a contributing factor. They're not going to know that that's the reason, and they're not going to associate that that's the reason. And so it's just very difficult to then study. But they do care about their penises one way or another. And the fact that they maybe have erectile dysfunction, or that they don't feel very much, or that they don't enjoy sex, or that they have to be rough. This is one thing that people say a lot, that the less sensitive, circumcised cut dicks, you have to be more rough to get any kind of stimulation. And that toll that takes not only on the person, but any of their sexual partners and anything derived from their interactions. So it's very personal. And you can very easily see how somebody could see like their very identity was destroyed. And he says, I didn't die today in 2017. I died 2 years ago in 2015 when this happened. That's not literally true, but in the sense that like this personal identity, his part of his identity was mutilated, and it was mutilated in a culture that doesn't vindicate or validate those feelings. They look at it like, get over it. It's not a big deal. Lots of men are cut. They don't have a problem because they never say anything, or they don't know to say anything. But there's a lot of silent men who do care about this. And I get this whenever I've posted about it. I will get some people who will reach out to me and say, this really matters to me. And they never say anything about it. And that's true. Like, this is kind of the surprising development of my channel in the last couple of years, is the videos about foreskin restoration and about circumcision. They get a lot of views. They get way more views than my political views, and they are perennial. People keep coming back to them, and people are very, very passionate about. Not all people, not every person. And there's plenty of uncircumcised men who find that just kind of interesting. Like, okay, this is a topic that I'm not aware of, that is not directly relevant to me, but I still find it fascinating. But a lot of men are deeply, deeply affected by this, and they do not have an effective outlet. And they're in a culture that just tells them, it's not a big deal. It doesn't mean anything. There's no difference. It doesn't matter. And you are crazy if you feel that way. That is, you're dismissed. And a common thing, I think it's in The Joy of Uncircumcising, some of the other books talk about, if you had been in an accident and lost a finger or an ear or a foot or whatever, and you could name a part that's greater or lesser importance than a foreskin, depending on your perspective. It doesn't really matter for the principle involved. If you went to a therapist and said, "Hey, I feel a sense of loss because again, I lost a body part," they would totally understand that and empathize and be like, "Okay, let's talk about it." Women feel this often when they lose their breasts, and kind of an analogy there. If we only did a survey of women who had mastectomies and asked how do they feel about breasts, and then generalized that, breasts are actually a source of great discomfort and pain among women, we should just cut them all off, you would say, whoa, whoa, whoa. You only surveyed women who had breast cancer. How about you survey all women before we start making generalized statements along that effect? Well, the surveys about sexual pleasure after circumcision are based on a similar selection bias. But regardless, but if you go to a therapist and you say, I'm upset because I don't have a foreskin because it was cut off when I was a child, and I'm mad that I didn't have a choice about it, and I feel emasculated, and I feel like, that I'm not a real man, blah, blah, blah. Very often the response is going to be, just get over it. What's your problem? I'm circumcised and I feel fine. I feel fine. I feel fine. I feel fine. That's what you hear over and over and over again. But they don't feel fine, and they have good reasons for it. Now, there's an argument to be made, hey, you shouldn't dwell on something that you can't really control, and that you should accept reality as it is and find a way to cope around it, and just dwelling forever. And that's all true. But that doesn't mean you can't acknowledge that there was something there, that there was actually a trauma, that there was actually a loss, that there was actually suffering, that there was actually pain, that there was actually diminishment. And, what steps you take to cope from that, rather than this shouldn't even be an issue. You have a mental problem for even thinking that it's an issue, which is the reaction many, many people have. So this is a tragic story. I don't know I'm kind of curious at the mentality of the editors at the BBC who just said, okay, this guy committed suicide and he wants it to be a big story, and we're making it a big story now. I wonder if everybody who wants to make some kind of causes celebrity with their death gets ignored, but they're not doing it for, they're doing it for this guy. And since this is a cause I identify with, I'm glad that they're doing it, even though it is a tragic situation. Um, it's too bad it's in the UK and not happening in the US, where the debate is much more needed. The UK has kind of already reached the conclusion that this is an unnecessary procedure that should be avoided in most cases. It's certainly tolerated, which is another degree of debate. It's one thing to say it's not necessary and shouldn't be done. It's another to say it should be banned, and that's a different ethical discussion to have that gets mired into the rights of parents and all that. But this debate, it's happening in the U.S. This is where it needs it the most. There's more people at stake than it is in the U.K. just by sheer population, and also uh, the circumcision culture is still very strong. We still have a strong anti-foreskin, pro-cutting culture in the United States, and this debate needs to happen, and it's starting to happen. And that's why I feel not just justified but interested in making videos on this topic. So I'll put a link to the article in the description. If anybody finds any more of what he wrote or what he wanted published or how he described his things, I only have the excerpts that are in the BBC article, which I didn't really quote too much, but I'll put the link. And anyway, I'll talk to you all later. Have a good night.